Could a luxurious mansion filled with servants and gold become the most terrifying prison for a woman? The external glamour of the Gilded Age concealed behind its walls dramas that were not even discussed aloud with those closest to them. We are used to seeing calm faces of ladies in exquisite dresses in old portraits, but their eyes often reveal deep, silent despair. Behind the closed doors of bedrooms, where peace should have reigned, tragedies of loneliness and complete powerlessness unfolded. These were rooms where hopes for happiness were shattered by cold rules of etiquette and the cruel will of husbands. Marriage at that time often became not a union of two hearts, but a life sentence with a beautiful facade. Women who possessed millions had no right to dispose of even their own destiny. Watch the video to the end to find out how diamond tiaras became crowns of thorns and why many aristocratic women envied their maids. What if I told you that everything you believed in while watching romantic movies is not true? The ballrooms of New York and London at the end of the 19th century resembled not a fairy tale, but a harsh marketplace where human beings were the commodity. Young girls were prepared for years for the only important event in their lives, their debut into society in a successful marriage. They were taught dancing, French, and the art of small talk like trained dolls. No one asked them about their feelings, dreams, or preferences because capital and titles were at stake. Mothers who had gone through this process pushed their daughters with cold determination into the arms of rich but often unloved men. The courtship process itself was strictly regulated and devoid of any spontaneity or sincerity. A girl could not be alone with a man for a minute, as she was constantly watched by dozens of eyes. Every wave of a fan, every turn of the head, was evaluated by potential suitors and their picky relatives. It was like selling a thoroughbred horse, where its breed, pedigree, and docility were checked. Huge fortunes changed hands, sealed by marriage contracts in which women were assigned the role of beautiful appendages. The dresses they wore were veritable engineering feats, restricting movement and breathing. Corsets were laced so tightly that fainting spells were commonplace at balls. This physical bondage was a direct reflection of social and emotional bondage. Girls learned to endure pain and discomfort with a smile on their faces as they prepared for their future lives. All these luxurious clothes were a kind of uniform that could not be taken off at will. Many brides walked down the aisle, barely holding back tears under thick lace veils. They saw before them not a loved one, but a stranger with whom they were to share a bed for the rest of their days. Fear of the unknown was mixed with a feeling of hopelessness and resignation to fate. The wedding ceremony turned into a lavish spectacle where the main character played the role of a happy bride. The luxurious interiors in which they lived were designed to demonstrate wealth, not comfort. Huge cold halls, marble staircases, and heavy furniture weighed heavily on the psyche. It was difficult to find a corner in these houses where one could feel at home. Women became part of the interior as expensive as a Chinese vase or a Persian carpet. High society demanded constant attendance at receptions, the opera, and charity events. One's smile had to be perfect, even if one's heart was breaking with grief. Any sign of sadness or discontent was perceived as ingratitude and hysteria. Life turned into an endless masquerade where a deep personal tragedy was hidden behind a mask of well-being. We would be very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about this approach to marriage, where feelings were completely sacrificed for status? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about how shocking the beginning of married life was for a Victorian girl? Education in those days was based on a complete denial of physicality and the physical side of love. Mothers deliberately hid the truth about marital duties from their daughters, limiting themselves to vague phrases. Girls entered into marriage with a naivety that bordered on complete ignorance. They believed in romantic ideals drawn from novels, but the reality turned out to be harsh and frightening. The first night of marriage often became a real psychological trauma for a young woman. Instead of tenderness and understanding, she was confronted with her husband's demands and rights to her body. The lack of basic knowledge turned a natural process into an act of violence and humiliation. Men raised in the same society rarely cared about the feelings of their inexperienced wives. For them, it was a matter of fulfilling a duty or satisfying a need that did not require emotional intimacy. It was in the bedroom that a woman most acutely felt her belonging to her husband as property. She could not refuse, could not leave, could not protect her personal space. The lock on the door was often just an illusion because her husband always had the key. This feeling of complete defenselessness in her own home destroyed her self-esteem and will to live. The luxurious decor of the bedroom, canopies, silk sheets, gilded mirrors, only emphasized the tragedy of the situation. This beauty seemed like a mockery of what was happening behind the closed curtains. A woman could lie surrounded by wealth, but feel like the most miserable beggar. The coldness of the relationship was transferred to the surrounding objects, making them alien and hostile. Shame was a constant companion of the Victorian wife. Shame for her body, for her husband's actions, for her thoughts. Religion and morality instilled the idea that a woman should be pure and dispassionate. Any deviation from this image caused feelings of guilt and sinfulness. This internal conflict tore at the soul and led to nervous breakdowns. Sometimes women tried to find solace in religion or charity, sublimating their unspent energy. They created a cocoon of rules and rituals around themselves to protect themselves from reality. But at night, when the house fell silent, the ghosts of unhappy marriages returned. The darkness of the bedroom became a silent witness to their tears and prayers for a different fate. Do you think women of that era could find any way to preserve their dignity in such circumstances? Want to know the secret hidden behind velvet curtains and heavy oak doors? The layout of wealthy homes of that era itself contributed to the separation of spouses and emotional coldness. The tradition of having separate bedrooms, connected only by a door or corridor, was the norm for the aristocracy. On the one hand, this was presented as respect for personal space, but in reality, it often became a symbol of alienation. Husband and wife lived parallel lives, meeting only at breakfast or at receptions. The woman's bedroom was often in one wing and the man's in another, or even on different floors. This physical distance allowed spouses to avoid real communication for years. A woman might not see her husband for weeks if he was busy with business or entertainment. She remained locked in her apartments, which became her only possession. This boudoir was both a refuge and a solitary confinement cell. There were many servants in these huge houses, but this only reinforced the feeling of isolation. The servants knew all the secrets of their masters, but were obliged to remain silent and pretend that nothing was happening. The woman could not even cry without fearing that the maid would hear and spread gossip. She had to keep up appearances at all times, even in her own bedroom. The mirrors that covered the walls constantly reminded the woman of her appearance and age. She saw how, over the years, the sparkle in her eyes faded and wrinkles appeared from constant worry. The mirror became a harsh judge, reflecting the fading beauty that was her only asset. Loneliness in front of the mirror was one of the most frightening moments of the day. Cold in the literal sense of the word permeated these huge rooms. Fireplaces could not warm the high ceilings and stone walls. Women constantly wrapped themselves in shawls and furs. But this cold was not only physical, but also emotional. The feeling of icy emptiness became a constant companion of the inhabitants of luxurious mansions. In some houses, special systems of bells and speaking tubes were created so that people would not have to meet unnecessarily. Communication was reduced to short notes delivered by a footman on a silver tray. It was a life lived according to a schedule, where human feelings were excluded from the equation. The mechanistic nature of everyday life killed everything alive in relationships. This architecture of alienation shaped generations of people incapable of intimacy and warmth. Children who grew up in such homes absorbed this model of behavior and carried it over into their future families. The walls of the mansions held memories of silence that was louder than any screams. Be sure to like this if you are also struck by this cold atmosphere. Guess what happened next when the honeymoon ended and everyday life began? The days of a wealthy woman turned into an endless series of dressing rituals. The morning began with choosing a dress for breakfast, followed by a dress for a walk, a dress for visits, a dress for tea, and finally an evening gown. This meaningless cycle of clothes took up most of her time and energy. The woman existed as a mannequin whose task was to demonstrate her husband's wealth through her appearance. Intellectual activity was not encouraged and was often directly condemned. It was believed that excessive reading or scientific pursuits spoiled the complexion and nervous system. Women were left with only embroidery, piano playing, and reading light French novels. Deprived of nourishment, the brain began to fade, plunging women into a state of apathy. Boredom became physically palpable, viscous, and suffocating. Attempts to engage in serious activities such as charity work often met with resistance. Husbands did not want their wives to come into contact with the dirt and poverty of the real world. Charity had to be beautiful. Balls, lotteries, patronage of exhibitions. Real help to those in need was replaced by writing checks. Limited freedom of movement was also a problem. A woman could not leave the house alone without being accompanied by a companion or a footman. Her every step was controlled, and every trip required approval. The city outside the carriage window seemed like a distant and inaccessible world, full of dangerous adventures. Her friends were in the same position, and communicating with them brought no relief. It was not customary to complain about one's fate. Everyone maintained the illusion of happiness. Women's gatherings turned into a vanity fair, where everyone boasted about their new clothes or their children's successes. True friendship and support were rare. Time dragged on unbearably slowly. The clock in the living room chimed every 15 minutes, reminding them of the emptiness of their passing lives. The women often just sat by the window, looking out at the street and dreaming of something unattainable. It was a state of frozen time where nothing had changed for years. Nervous disorders, migraines, and fainting spells became a way to at least somehow diversify this routine. Illness gave them the legitimate right not to participate in social life and to demand attention. It was a kind of protest by the body against unnatural conditions of existence. Poor health became part of the female image. This is how the best years of life passed, in a golden cage, where the bars were made of prejudice and obligations. Youth faded, dreams were forgotten, and all that remained was the habit of being a beautiful doll. What do you think was harder to bear, the lack of freedom or the lack of meaning in life? In the next chapter, you will learn how the medicine of the time turned female melancholy into a diagnosis. In those days, women's dissatisfaction with life, sadness, or desire for change were often interpreted by doctors as a medical pathology. Any deviation from the image of a submissive and contented wife was called hysteria or nervous exhaustion. Medicine was completely in the hands of men, who saw women not as patients in need of help, but as broken mechanisms that needed to be repaired. Complaints of boredom or indifference on the part of a husband were perceived as symptoms of uterine or nervous disorders. More brutal methods were also used, such as cold baths, electric shock, and surgical interventions. Removal of the ovaries or uterus was sometimes suggested as a remedy for excessive emotionality. Women were completely powerless in the face of medical authority. Their bodies did not belong to them. They were controlled by their husbands and doctors. Narcotic substances such as opium, laudanum, and morphine were widely used. They were prescribed for headaches, insomnia, and female ailments. Many noble ladies became quiet drug addicts, spending their days in a semi-daze. This was convenient for those around them. Women became submissive, quiet, and caused no trouble. The diagnosis of hysteria was a convenient label that allowed any real problems a woman had to be ignored. If she cried, screamed, or demanded respect, it was considered an illness. A husband could send his wife to a sanatorium or clinic with a sympathetic look, getting rid of inconvenient questions. Psychiatric clinics at that time were overflowing with healthy women who had been driven to despair. Doctors often became confidants of husbands, reporting to them on their wives' behavior and thoughts. Medical confidentiality did not apply to the spouse who paid the bills. A woman could not trust a doctor, knowing that her every word would be used against her. This created an atmosphere of total mistrust and fear. The very idea that a woman could be an individual with her own desires was rejected by the science of the time. Women's physiology was considered primitive and completely subordinate to reproductive function. Anything that went beyond this function was considered an anomaly. Women's rebellion was suppressed with pills and potions. Thus, medicine became another bar in the golden cage. Instead of help and understanding, women received new restrictions and suffering. Their souls were crippled under the guise of treatment, forcing them to accept an unbearable reality. What lay behind the beautiful picture of high society parties was often worse than any poverty. The main task of an aristocrat was to preserve the impeccable reputation of her family at any cost. It was strictly forbidden to air the family's dirty laundry in public. Even if her husband gambled away his fortune, openly lived with his mistress, or raised his hand against his wife, she had to smile. In public, the spouses presented themselves as the perfect couple, exchanging pleasantries and holding hands. This need to wear a mask 24 hours a day led to tremendous internal tension. A woman could not relax for a minute, always expecting a trick or a condemning glance. Her face turned into a frozen porcelain mask, behind which fear and pain were hidden. She was only allowed to cry into her pillow, and only so that there would be no swelling in the morning. Organizing receptions and balls was hard work that fell on the shoulders of the hostess. She had to remember thousands of little details. Who was quarreling with whom, where to seat whom, what menu to choose. Any slip-up or mistake was perceived as a personal disgrace and failure. The success of the evening was the only criterion for her worth as a woman. Children also became hostages to this game. They were dressed up like dolls and brought out to guests to demonstrate the family idol. But behind closed doors, children often witnessed their parents' coldness and quarrels. They learned hypocrisy from infancy, understanding that no one needed the truth. Letters and diaries from that time are full of hints and understatements. Women were afraid to entrust their true thoughts to paper, fearing that they would be read. Even in their personal space, they were not free from censorship. Their lives were written by someone else, and they only played a role. There were cases when the mask became part of the face. A woman became so immersed in the role of a happy socialite that she lost touch with her true self. She became an empty shell, perfectly performing social rituals. Her feelings atrophied, leaving only automatism. The price of this game was high. Early mortality, suicides disguised as accidents, and broken lives. The glamour of the ballroom did not illuminate happiness, but rather the grandiose backdrop of human misery. Do you think the reputation of such victims is worth it? In the next chapter, you will learn about the fates of those who were called dollar princesses. A special category of victims at that time were wealthy American heiresses whose parents married them off to European aristocrats. Industrialist fathers from the New World wanted to buy titles for their daughters, and British lords needed money to repair their crumbling estates. The girls became bargaining chips in this transatlantic deal, trading the comforts of Fifth Avenue for the dampness of old castles. These dollar princesses came to England with dreams of romance and life at court. But the reality was harsh. Huge, drafty mansions without central heating or running water. American women accustomed to bathrooms and warmth froze in their new homes, wrapping themselves in woolen shawls even in summer. Millions of their dollars went to patching holes in roofs and paying off their husbands' car debts. Husbands, having gained access to their wives' money, often lost all interest in them. They continued to live their bachelor lives, spending their dowries on hunting, horses, and mistresses. Their wives were needed only as a source of finance and an incubator for an heir to the title. These women were overwhelmed by feelings of being used and deceived. Loneliness in a foreign land was particularly acute. Far from family, friends, and familiar culture, they felt completely isolated. Letters home took weeks to arrive, and visits from relatives were rare. American women often did not understand English humor and reserve, which created an even greater gap in communication. Often, these women found solace only in their children, giving them all their unspent love. They tried to give them the best education and upbringing, attempting to protect them from the harshness of the English system. But even here, they were confronted with the tradition of sending children to boarding schools from an early age. The dollar princesses brought not only money to Europe, but also new energy, fashion, and perspectives. However, the price they paid for their titles of duchesses and countesses was exorbitantly high. Behind the ceremonial portraits and tiaras were women longing for sunlight and simple human warmth. Their stories are a reminder that marriages of convenience, even the most glamorous ones, rarely bring happiness. Gold dollars could repair the walls of a castle, but they could not mend broken hearts. The main and, in fact, only task of a woman in such a marriage was to bear an heir. As soon as Mendelssohn's March sounded, the young wife was expected to announce her pregnancy. If this did not happen within the first year, the pressure from her husband's family became unbearable. The woman was accused of failing to fulfill her duty, hinted at her inferiority and even sinfulness. Pregnancy itself was often difficult. Corsets were only allowed to be removed in the last few months, which was harmful to both the mother and the child. Women had to hide their condition for as long as possible, as the appearance of a pregnant woman was considered unaesthetic. They stopped going out in public and found themselves even more isolated. The birth of a daughter was often perceived as a failure. The husband needed a son to pass on his surname and title. If a girl was born, the woman felt guilt and disappointment from those around her. She was made to understand that she had to try again and again until a boy was born. Women's bodies were worn out by frequent childbirth, but no one cared. As soon as a child was born, it was taken away from its mother almost immediately. In aristocratic families, it was not customary for the mother to feed or care for the baby herself. The child was handed over to a wet nurse and then to a staff of nannies. Motherhood was reduced to brief visits to the nursery at strictly designated times. If a child died, and infant mortality was high even in wealthy families, the mother's grief had to be restrained. Mourning was observed according to the rules, but hysterics and prolonged grief were considered bad form. A woman had to recover quickly and be ready to give birth to the next spare heir. The nursery, often located on the top floor, was a world of its own, where mothers' access was restricted. Nannies had more power over children than parents. Women felt superfluous in the lives of their own children, whom they had given birth to in agony. Motherhood, which should have been a source of joy, turned into work on an assembly line for producing heirs. Women were merely vessels, instruments for continuing the family line, whose feelings and health were of no importance. The death of a husband was an event that radically changed a woman's life, often for the better. Despite the strict rules of mourning, widowhood paradoxically gave a woman the freedom she had been deprived of in marriage. For the first time, she became the mistress of her own destiny and often her own fortune. Of course, outwardly, she had to portray inconsolable grief, but inside, many felt relief. Mourning etiquette was incredibly complex and strict. A widow had to wear a black crepe dress and a long veil for a year or two. She was forbidden to attend balls and theaters, receive guests, or even laugh loudly. She became a black shadow, a symbol of mourning. Any violation of these rules was condemned by society as disrespectful to the memory of the deceased. However, behind the closed doors of the mansion, the widow gained control over the finances and the house. She no longer had to report to her husband for every penny she spent. She could rearrange the furniture, dismiss unpleasant servants, or finally do what interested her. Many widows began to actively engage in patronage, travel, or manage estates during this period. Some women, freed from the bonds of marriage, categorically refused to remarry. They remembered all too well the price of women's happiness and did not want to put themselves back under the yoke. They preferred to be merry widows, enjoying their freedom and independence. Mourning clothes, despite their gloominess, served as excellent protection. They created distance, allowing women to be invisible to unwanted suitors. Under a black veil, it was possible to hide not only tears, but also a smile of relief and a curious glance. During this period, women often became close with other widows, forming their own social circles. There, without men, they could be frank, support each other, and discuss real problems. It was a sisterhood born of a shared experience of loss and self-discovery. Widowhood was the only socially acceptable way for a woman to live independently. Society forgave a widow what it would not forgive a wife or a maiden. It was a strange, bitter freedom. Freedom bought at the price of another person's death and years of her own patience. It was often widows who became the most influential figures of their time, founding museums, hospitals, and universities. Left alone, they proved that women were capable of great things if the shackles of patriarchal marriage were removed. Today, walking through the museum estates of that era, we see only a beautiful shell. Tour guides talk about the cost of paintings, famous architects, and the balls that were held here. But if you listen carefully, you can hear the echoes of women's sighs in the silence of these rooms. Antique mirrors remember the reflections of tear-stained faces, and velvet couches bear the marks of bodies tormented by corsets and longing. Diaries and letters found in the archives lift the veil of secrecy over the real lives of these women. In them, we read not about balls, but about illnesses, fear of husbands, longing for children, and the desire to break free. These yellowed pages are evidence of the invisible war that women waged for the right to be people, not things. History often ignores the emotional side of life, focusing on wars and politics. But real history was made here, in bedrooms and nurseries, where characters were formed and destinies were broken. The price of progress and prosperity during the Gilded Age was paid with women's misery and silence. Many of these houses now stand empty or have been converted into offices, but their atmosphere still retains a sense of sadness. They are monuments not only to architecture, but also to female loneliness. They remind us that happiness is not measured by the number of carats or square meters. The legacy of these women lives on in us, in our struggle for equality and respect. We are the voices they never had. We can tell their stories and pay tribute to their resilience and patience. Behind every great man of that era stood the shadow of a woman whose life was sacrificed to his ambitions. And today we are finally bringing them out of the shadows and into the light, restoring their names and their truth. It is the least we can do for those who lived and died in golden chains. We have walked through the corridors of time, peering into the most intimate corners of the lives of women of the Gilded Age. We have seen that behind the glitz of the balls lay tears, and behind the luxury of the interiors lay the coldness of alienation. These stories force us to take a fresh look at the past and appreciate the freedom we have today. How did this story make you feel? Did it evoke sympathy, anger, or perhaps recognition of certain moments? Share your thoughts in the comments because every story deserves to be heard. Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on new journeys into the mysteries of history.